This is United States History 202, Presentation 12, Progressives in Power, Domestic Policy 1901 to 1921. So what I'm going to do with this particular presentation is talk about how progressivism, which we talked about in Presentation 10, affected domestic policy. We looked at that a little bit in terms of foreign policy and imperialism. It was a driving factor in that. But let's see how it affected domestic policy, not just at the federal level or the general government, the central government, but also at the state and local level and in some other areas as well. So at the national level, you had the expanded role for the federal government. And this is the whole idea of nationalism. Having a national government is definitely part of progressivism. So you often hear people say that the central government is the national government. Well, as we talked about when we looked at progressivism in terms of an ideology, nationalism was part of that. So just this process of calling the central government the national government, this one-size-fits-all situation, is part of progressivism in general. At the state and local level, though, you had other things going on. For example, you had more direct democracy techniques. These things included things like primaries. A primary is where the people get to pick the candidates for the party. So the registered voters for the Democratic Party get to pick the Democratic candidate. Republican Party get to pick the Republican candidate. Sometimes, if you have an open primary system, you can be registered for either party and still go vote for the candidate. So it depends on which state in which you live and how that works. Initiative is where the people can actually get something placed on the ballot through a certain number of signatures. So this is a ballot initiative. So if you want to see something on your ballot in a state that has it, you can get so many signatures and it would show up on the ballot during the election cycle. Referendum is where the legislature actually does that itself. Most of the time this is done for taxes. The legislature, this is a way out for the legislature. They don't want to go on record as supporting a tax increase. So they put it on as a referendum. And that way, if the people voted in, then the people are on the hook for it. If not, then they can say, well, we were opposed to it. So it's a way for legislatures to get out of any kind of sticky situations. A recall is where you actually, if you have an elected official like a governor or something of that nature, you actually get them out of office. You recall them from office. This has happened several times, well, at least in terms of actually having a governor recalled. It happened in California. With a governor there named Gray Davis. He was recalled, and then of course there was another election, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected governor. So in this case it wasn't a recall, it was a total recall. It's also happened most recently in Colorado. There were a couple of legislators there recalled because of their, again this is 2013, because of their opposition, or at least their support I should say, to gun control legislation. So Colorado had some pretty stringent gun control laws, and these people were recalled because of that. It was also attempted in Wisconsin in 2012. So this is something that happens with the governor there. This is something that happens, and it is an interesting direct democracy technique. And also hired city officials. The idea was that you get away from cronyism. You don't have the mayor able to appoint all of his buddies or his family members to city departments. So you hire these people in, and therefore it's more professional local government. Building codes, things like you have to have fire codes and things of that nature come out of the progressive movement. City zoning ordinances, you only have things like agricultural areas or industrial areas. So this is planning. Public funding for schools was a big deal during the progressive movement, as we've already talked about with John Dewey, and also infrastructure spending, things like roads, bridges, things of that nature. That's also going to be very popular programs for the government to get involved in, both the local and, of course, the general government as well. Prohibition is often not discussed in terms of a progressive agenda, but it was. In fact, Prohibition was born out of, in many ways, the women's movement, because women were upset with their husbands or significant others, boyfriends, whoever it was, going out and drinking too much and coming home and being abusive verbally or physically. So Prohibition was definitely came out of this women's rights movement, but also, of course, churches as well pushing a Prohibition position. Sin taxes and laws. Sin laws and taxes, excuse me. So things like laws against prostitution or drugs, all of these things came out of the progressive movement. We'll talk more about Prohibition in a later presentation. Birth control was also a progressive agenda, still is, again, put in context of the women's rights movement. Birth control was something that the women's rights movement was an early proponent of. So let me talk about that. The woman behind that was named Margaret Sanger. She lived from 1879 to 1966. And she really is the founder of the modern birth control movement. She founded Planned Parenthood. Initially, Sanger actually said she got involved in birth control because she wanted to prevent abortions, which were illegal at the time. And so she started advocating birth control. This was against the law. Birth control was against the law. And so at this time period in the early 20th century. So eventually what happened is the only way you could get birth control is you had to get it from your doctor if you were married. Only married couples could have birth control. But then eventually that was unmarried women could get it as well. And that was right about the time that Margaret Sanger died. The question is, was there any racial motivation behind this? Sanger denied, or at least the Sanger supporters denied, but Sanger, for example, spoke at a Ku Klux Klan rally. She was a proponent of eugenesis, she was a eugenicist, I should say, which is the purity of genes. Her magazine that she helped found was very much behind the eugenics movement. So she did believe in racially superior people, and so she made some statements that would seem like they were very racist in nature. Essentially wanted to prohibit mass growth in racial minority populations. But, of course, the people that use birth control most frequently are the people that obviously Sanger, in her mind, wanted to keep having lots of kids, and those are white middle-class Americans. So obviously, if she was looking for racial motivation, it wasn't, and the results weren't there as she wanted. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, in terms of a progressive in power, Roosevelt was the 26th president. We talked about him in foreign policy. Served from 1901 to 1909, but he really was the first progressive president. Not just because of his foreign policy. You could look at McKinley in that way too, but in terms of the square deal, which was his domestic policy. And this is really where things change a little bit. Presidents start to initiate legislation. They start to become much more active in the legislative sphere. It didn't mean that didn't happen before, but presidents now have legislative agendas, which they didn't have essentially up until Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt, from New York, from an old Dutch family around New York, so he had a lot of money. He was seen as a very energetic guy, drank about a gallon of coffee a day, was an interesting character. A lot of times it was thought that he was compensating for his sickly childhood, whether it was boxing or hunting, things of that nature. So he's always trying to be more of a man than maybe he actually was, but he's compensating in that way. But let's talk about this square deal. He said Americans deserve a square deal. And basically Roosevelt said he was a president for the people, and I have a link there that you should watch. But Roosevelt wanted to regulate business and provide more government involvement in the American economy. He wanted to be a president that initiates legislation. Of course, he had his aggressive foreign policy. The interesting thing about Roosevelt, he's actually given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 for negotiating a cease to the war between Russia and Japan. But he was also very aggressive in terms of military. So just because you get a peace prize doesn't mean that you're actually a very peaceful person, and Roosevelt was not that. The other thing that he was known for was conservation, which is environmentalism, environmental conservation, which we'll talk about in a second. So when he came to things like regulation of business, he believed in breaking up companies, trust busting they called it. For example, the Northern Securities Company was broken up. It was one of J.P. Morgan's companies. We talked about him in Presentation 6. He intervened in the coal labor strike in 1902 on the side of labor, not on the side of the coal companies, which was unique. Had the Department of Commerce and Labor created in 1903. Signed the Hepburn Act of 1906, which strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission. Signed the Pure Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which was on the heels of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. So there's a lot of reform-minded legislation here and a lot of labor-minded legislation that's being put into effect during the Roosevelt administration. One of his allies was a man named Robert M. Fighting Bob La Follette. He was from Wisconsin. Pushed for government regulation of corporations, was a firm environmentalist, and this is often called Agrarian Republicanism. Sometimes people look at this as Marxist, but there was a strain of North Midwestern Republicans, people like Lafayette, people like the Lindberghs, who we're going to talk about when we get to a little later in the class, but C.A. Lindbergh, Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. These people were, you could say they were Marxist, and at times they sounded very Marxist, very socialistic, but at the same time this is kind of an agrarian republicanism with a capital R. What they were concerned about was big business and big corporations getting too much involved in the government. Unfortunately, these people didn't recognize that big government could also do the same things. This kind of goes back to, we talked about this with populism. So the original populists distrusted big government and big business, most importantly a fusion of both. But what these agrarian Republicans looked at was just big business as a problem and not big government. And so they were kind of Marxist in that way. But then again, they were also kind of following an American conservative tradition of agrarianism. Roosevelt was very popular, I might say. He decided that if he was elected in 1904, he would not run again. Remember, he was vice president. McKinley was shot, so he had never been elected president. He's going to win in 1904 in a landslide over a very conservative Democrat named Alton Parker. In fact, the last conservative Democrat to be nominated by that party for president. So this is the last election really in the 20th century where you had an old-style conservative running for office. I know people will say, what about Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge and even into Ronald Reagan? But they're not conservatives the way that Alton Parker was. He's an old Jeffersonian, Jacksonian Democrat. So here's the 2004 election. You can see Roosevelt wins very handily. And a Judge magazine cartoon. Now, conservation was also a big issue for Roosevelt. We had the national park system created. Yosemite and Yellowstone national parks were put into effect during his administration. And essentially what you have is government ownership of property. He signed into law the National Monuments Act of 1906. So the idea was governments would own property, and of course that would protect and preserve or conserve that property. Now, Roosevelt looked at things a little differently. He thought this conservation would actually hold natural resources and other things so the United States could use them. What's happened recently is that we have all these resources being held, but nobody wants to use them. They just want to sit on them, which is in some ways kind of odd. Now, Gifford Pinchot was head of the National Forest Service during the Roosevelt administration from Connecticut. He believed in public ownership of forests. In fact, he helped create the theory that individuals ruin land while government protects and conserves it. This is called the conservation ethic. And it's actually interesting. Callaway Gardens, which is just north of Columbus in Pine Mountain, it's a privately owned entity. They have a video when you go in there, and they actually attack the conservation ethic. Because it is privately owned and they're conserving property. So they're attacking this idea that only government can conserve or preserve property. Individuals won't do it, they'll just ruin it. They're trying to work against that idea. And other people have said this as well, that government sometimes actually destroys property, doesn't actually conserve it. Individuals can do more for conservation than government can. Of course, John Muir was also an interesting guy here from California, preservationist. And loved the Yosemite Valley, and he was the founder of what's called the Sierra Club, and really the origin of the modern environmentalist movement. So he took Roosevelt hiking in Yosemite Valley, and this is why Roosevelt wanted to preserve this area from development. But John Muir was definitely a driving intellectual force in what we see today in terms of the modern environmentalist movement, believed wholeheartedly in the conservation ethic and other things. But the national park system does owe a lot, at least the creation of that, to John Muir. Now, Roosevelt would handpick his successor. That would be William Howard Taft from Ohio, the 27th President of the United States, served one term, 1909 to 1913. Taft, of course, had excellent credentials. He was Secretary of War, at one point had influence in the Caribbean and the Pacific, yet he and Roosevelt had different personalities. This is the guy, of course, that would get stuck in the bathtub. He was in the White House. He was a very large individual, weighed in around 400 pounds, and so he wasn't as active, he wasn't as energetic. Taft really didn't want to be president. His wife wanted to be president, so he accepted the nomination. He wanted to be a Supreme Court judge, which later he will actually have that position. So here's the 1908 election. You can see it's a landslide for Taft. The Democrats would nominate William Jennings Bryan again, so they go back to kind of a left-wing candidate. But the question is, how progressive was Taft? He had more antitrust suits than Roosevelt, so he was actually more progressive in that regard. The postal savings system was put into effect during the Taft administration, which is something progressives wanted. I talked about that in one of the last presentations. The Income Tax Amendment was implemented during his administration, the 16th Amendment. You had the direct election of senators, which was the 17th Amendment. So those were both very progressive agendas, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But Taft is often considered to be not very progressive because of his dispute with Gifford Pinchot. He split with the agrarian side of this stuff on conservation. He didn't think that the government should be involved in conservation as much. And so the party actually split in 1912. Roosevelt will be called out of retirement, asked to come run in the 1912 election, and he will. He tried to get the Republican nomination. He failed. And so the Republicans will nominate William Howard Taft. Roosevelt will form his own party called the Bull Moose or Progressive Party. Eugene Debs, who we talked about in the presentation on labor, presentation 7, will be nominated by the Socialist Party. And then Woodrow Wilson gets the nomination for the Democrats. So essentially what you have is Roosevelt against Wilson, with Taft kind of riding on there with the Republican Party. So Woodrow Wilson was born in Virginia but then lived in New Jersey. So he was a Southerner by birth. He had a Ph.D. in history and government. Good progressive is going to have these kind of things. And of course, that would force him to rely on quote-unquote intellectuals or experts for advice. He was the president of Princeton University for a time. And Wilson had his own legislative agenda that he called the New Freedom. He was a progressive reformer, and what he believed more in was regulation rather than trust busting. So, or at least he wanted to break these companies up entirely, not just kind of put a Band-Aid on things. So here's the 1912 election. You can see none of these candidates get 50% of the vote, but Wilson's going to get the vast majority of the Electoral College vote because Roosevelt and Taft split the vote in those states. So the New Freedom said that the president is the political leader of the nation. Again, there's that term nation being thrown around. He started delivering the State of the Union address in person rather than writing it out and delivering it to the Senate or the House to be read. This is the way it had been done since the Jefferson administration. So Wilson's going back to the practices under the Adams and Washington administration. Now, he believed the president was more prime minister and president. So the idea here was to get back into the Congress and actually initiate legislation. He relied on intellectuals for advice, which of course is a major component of progressivism. The New Freedom in terms of legislation called for tariff reduction, which they will get. So the Republicans historically had advocated a much higher tariff, the Democrats a much lower tariff. That's going to flip later on in American history, but he believed in a graduated income tax. So we have the Income Tax Amendment, but there's nothing that says how it has to be implemented. Well, he wanted a graduated income tax, where the rich paid more and the poor paid less. The Federal Reserve System will be implemented during his administration. The Federal Trade Commission Act and Clayton Antitrust Act, both there to regulate or break up big business. And the government's going to get involved in the loan business. They're going to start giving loans to farmers. So the idea was to help out farmers when they needed a little financial stability. They could get some money from the federal government, and that would help them. Now, the Federal Reserve, though, was the big monster in the room. In fact, there's a book entitled The Creature from Jekyll Island. I've got a link there. It's about an hour-and-a-half video. It's well worth your time to watch it, from the guy that wrote the book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. It's a very interesting video. But essentially what happened is the United States government will change the central banking system. This is the current United States Central Bank. The question is a central bank constitutional? Jefferson said no. James Madison initially said no. So many in the founding generation said a central bank was unconstitutional, yet we have one. The central bank could have very much caused the Great Depression with their credit policies and fractional reserve banking. So you can lend out more than you have, and this, of course, is going to create bubbles, and those bubbles will eventually burst, and then your economy will contract. It's exactly what happened in 2007 and 2008 in the United States. And, of course, it's going to create inflation because the government's going to print more money, or at least the Federal Reserve is going to print more money, and that's going to create an inflationary situation in the United States. So here you see that, and when the line goes way up there, that's when we entirely went off a precious metal standard around 1973 during the Nixon administration. Now, one of Wilson's advisors was a man named Colonel, quote-unquote, Colonel Edward M. House. He wasn't a colonel in actuality, but he was called Colonel. That was his nickname. He lived in the White House, and he advised Wilson in every aspect of the administration. The only time Wilson stopped relying on House was at Versailles, when he was trying to hammer out the Treaty of Versailles, and basically Wilson said, you go home. He wrote a very important book entitled Philip Drew Administrator. Now, not important because it's a big seller or because it's very good. In fact, it's a very bad book. but it outlined what the new freedom was going to be in fictional form. So if you ever get a chance to read this thing, it's a utopian novel, or dystopian novel in some ways. If you want to know more about the Wilson administration, it's a good book to pick up and read, because it shows you everything Wilson is going to do. And it's eerie how the book Philip Drew Administrator mirrors the Wilson administration. As I mentioned before, you're going to get the progressive amendments to the Constitution. So the 16th Amendment, which is the income tax amendment, now we get an income tax. It doesn't say how to implement this amendment, or what income to tax or things like that. But we've got a much higher income tax amendment than what they had in 1913 today. The 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators. So now senators are not elected by the state legislatures; they're elected directly by the people, which is going to forever change the composition of the central government. Because if the senators are elected by the state legislatures, and the states still have control over these people, but if the senators are elected by the people, the states have no control over the senators in the United States Senate. The 18th Amendment is a prohibition amendment, so no alcohol being manufactured, consumed, or distributed in the United States until later, after the 1930s. And then, of course, the 19th Amendment, which was the women's suffrage amendment. So now women have the right to vote after the 19th Amendment. Okay, well, that's it for Presentation 12, and we will pick up with some new material next time for 13. All right, see you then.